And so it is my pleasure and honor now to introduce our next speaker, a really wonderful person from the UK. Hugh Newman is featured on the Ancient Aliens History Channel television series about the lost evidence of giants. He's sort of the younger generation picking up this torch and carrying it because it's really important information. He's just a wonderful person and has some really brilliant presentations to provide. I really have a great admiration for Hugh. He has megalithomania in the UK. He offers tours to sacred sites and conferences in Britain. So a big Earthkeeper round of applause for Hugh Newman, please.
Thank you, James. Appreciate your introductions very much. I'm going to hire you for my conference, I think, just to introduce me. So anyway, thank you for coming to my lecture. I'm not going to be doing a sermon or anything, even though it's Sunday, but we are going to be talking about very tall, strange human beings called the giants. Now, this is one of those subjects which most people simply don't believe in. But I do. I'm a believer in giants. Some of you may have seen the show we put together called Search for the Lost Giants. This came out on History Channel about a year ago, in fact, and it was a 6-part series. And with my good friend Jim Vieira and his brother Bill Vieira, as well as Ross Hamilton, some of you may have heard of Ross Hamilton, we put together this show, and it was probably the weirdest show that's ever come out on History Channel, where a bunch of grown men search for lost giants through the American countryside. Now, you might think, well, what are they talking about? What do you mean giants? Well, we have gathered over 1,500 newspaper accounts, scholarly accounts, academic research, excavation reports, diaries of well-known authorities, and even photos from newspapers and other sources of giant skeletons ranging between 7 feet tall and 18 feet tall in North America. We even have some accounts in Arkansas, we have them in Oklahoma, all the surrounding states to where we are now. There have been giant skeletons found. Now, this sounds strange, but many of them have been found in the mounds. The earthworks scattered, 100,000 or so originally in North America. Many of them were found in caves, even at the bottom of rivers, in certain types of bogs in Florida, for instance. But majority of them have been found in these mounds, and it appears they were a royal class of Native American giants who ruled this part of the world for many millennia. We have some dating, even going back to about 8,000 years old, of mummified red-haired remains in the southwest. Now, this is not a hoax. However, these are. All these pictures here that have been going around the internet are not real. These are Photoshop, and they're just not real. What happened was, let me just explain. In 2002, there was a competition online on the Worth 1000 website where they do Photoshop competitions, and this one was about archaeological digs and, more importantly, giant skeletons. So many of these were put out, and they've been doing the rounds for a long time until the present day. People are still publishing these in books thinking they're real, and they're not, unfortunately. So unfortunately, none of these are real, but genuine accounts we do have, we believe are real. They're very real, and they're very strange, and it gets weirder and weirder the more you look into it. Many of you will know giants from the historical record, from myths and legends. On the left there, we have David defeating Goliath and holding his head up. And in fact, David and Goliath is a very interesting story because him and his brothers went hunting giants, or Goliath's brothers, after he defeated Goliath. And they were the first giant hunters in history. On the right there, we have King Og's bed, King Og of Bashan, who was a Canaanite king in the Bible lands, going back at least 1,000 or 2,000 BC. And his bed measured between 9 feet and 13 feet long. And so he was said to be about 10 or 12 feet tall, and he was a giant ruler in that part of the world. And we have many accounts, many stories from the Old Testament, from the Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, and so forth, that talk about matter-of-fact accounts of giants, the Rephaim, the Nephilim, the Canaanites, and Anakin, and so on and so forth. Even in England, we have the famous story of Jack the Giant Slayer, or Jack the Giant Killer. Now, this was the precursor to Jack and the Beanstalk. Many of you have heard of Jack and the Beanstalk, but basically what happened was the original story, which goes back possibly into prehistory, was actually this sort of teenager who went around killing off the giants, beheading them, stabbing them, and actually really quite kind of quite violent. It was like a sort of violent action film version of an old story. But then later, when the Victorian sort of children's books were coming out, they created a much more toned down version, made it more magical and turned it into Jack and the Beanstalk. So that's how that story developed. But Jack the Giant Killer, they think, was based on a real person who really didn't like the giants of old and actually would go around killing them. And there is evidence of giant skeletons all over England, as well as all over the British Isles and throughout Europe. I think one of the most interesting stories of England is the founding of Britain, where Brutus the Trojan came over and came to the shores of southern Britain to found a new colony of Troy. And this is back in the 1100s. This was written down by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote History of the Kings of Britain. And he defeated a giant called Gog Magog on the shores, and he was the last remaining giant of the British Isles, and he threw him into the sea and took over. Actually, last weekend, and this happens every year, they parade around effigies of the giants Gog and Magog through the city of London. So the tradition still goes on till today. But it's really North America I want to look at, mainly in this lecture, and that's what we cover mainly in the new book that's co-authored with Jim Vieira. But I want to just show you some accounts from my neck of the woods first, in Europe, or Britain more specifically. These were collected by a researcher called Cecilia Hall. She's a brilliant researcher. She's been working with us over the last couple of years, putting all the accounts we collect into Google Earth. So we've got a really clear database of where they were discovered. This is obviously the North American section. This isn't even all of them. This is just some of them. And we can only fit 250 accounts into the book. I want to get through as many as I can today, but not quite that many, because I literally have 1 hour. But Europe as well, this is just some of the accounts. We've found more since we did these maps. But I want to focus on an area up here. This is actually the town I grew up in, called Cambridge. When I was 9 years old, I moved to a village called Cherry Hinton on the suburbs of Cambridge, and actually it is next to what are called the Gog Magog Hills, which I found very interesting. I didn't know at the time that it was a reference to giants. But what is found here in the 1800s, in 1838, a newspaper report came out where some taller than average skeletons were found upon the top of the Gog Magog Hills. Now, interestingly, there's a sacred spring at the base of the hills, just here, called the Giant's Grave, or Magog's Grave, and it's got a 20-foot island in the middle of it. Up here, up on the hills, are the war ditches, and this is where the 9 burials were found. And the whole area has legends of giants hiding in caves and terrorizing the locals. I didn't even know this. I grew up there, and I went to school just next to where the giants were discovered. And so I was kind of brought into this strange landscape at 9 years old, living in the realm of the giants. So wherever you go in this strange world, you can find references to these great beings, actual accounts of them being dug up from the ground. Perhaps the most famous archaeological site in the world, but certainly in England, is Stonehenge. This, again, is related to the giants. The original name of Stonehenge, does anybody know what it was? Okay, good. I'll sound sensational there. It was actually called the Giant's Dance. That was the first known written down name of this particular site. Stonehenge is a later Saxon name. And this is the earliest known depiction of Stonehenge, which is based on, again, the History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, written in the mid-1100s. And this shows Merlin on the left here instructing a giant to lift the stones into place. I find that fascinating. This is the earliest depiction of Stonehenge, and we have this. And it is said, according to the Geoffrey of Monmouth, that the stones originally came from North Africa. They were moved to a place called Killarus in Ireland, and then they were magically transported from Ireland over to Salisbury Plain. And this is when Stonehenge was built by the giants. Now, is there any evidence of giant skeletons found around Stonehenge? And there certainly is. This is not an original picture. But there's a story that goes back. John Aubrey, who was one of the antiquarians in the 1600s, and for 100 years or so, this giant skull was on display in a local church, which would have measured 9 feet tall. This is a very interesting one. It's from a paper from 1830, and it describes a 9'4" skeleton unearthed near Salisbury, which is basically next to Stonehenge, in 1719. It also recounts a mound named Giant's Grave in the area. And in this book as well, Collectiania, Leyland quotes the respectable authority of his friend Sir Thomas Eliot, and he remembers seeing near Salisbury again a skeleton which measured 14 feet and 10 inches in length. That's twice the height of most of us here, I would imagine, apart from James, who I think is one of the giants, by the way. This is another one. This doesn't mention, a lot of accounts you literally have to throw out. This is the same kind of story we find in North America. Most of the accounts don't mention the height. They just mention skeleton of large dimensions or something similar. But again, this was found very, very close to Stonehenge. And here we find a shorter giant, which is a 7-foot tall example. But it's interesting that it was found buried in a kind of megalithic grave. My current hometown of Glastonbury has its own giants too. This is from the 1190s, where this is a very strange and convoluted story, but I'll shorten it and tighten it up just to give you an outline of it. In 1190, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey had these visions about King Arthur and Guinevere being buried in the area of Glastonbury, especially in Glastonbury Abbey, or the monastery where they were living. And they informed King Henry II, and then he told them about a long-lost secret that Arthur's remains, King Arthur, was buried in the churchyard of St Dunstan in Glastonbury, and a search was then commissioned. They excavated the site, they got down to 16 feet below the surface, and they came across a massive oak trunk, just as Henry had described. And they dug out the skeleton from it, and it was measured apparently over 9 feet tall. And it was so large that you could put a fist would fit between the eye sockets. Next to it was a female skeleton with blonde hair, which they believed was Guinevere. So this created this whole sensation. And this was also found there as well, this lead cross, which had inscribed on it a translation of Latin. Here lies interred the famous King Arthur on the Isle of Avalon. And so this, they think, may have been a hoax created by the monks, because King Arthur was a big story back then because of the history of the kings of Britain that had come out earlier that century, authored by Geoffrey of Monmouth. But we do find that I just find this a particularly compelling story, because this was backed up and it was researched by various other people, and even in 1962 to 63. Some further excavations were done, and an archaeologist confirmed that a prominent personage had indeed been buried there at the period in question, confirming the date and confirming the huge oak coffin and the burial that had been found. And so even in, where I grew up and my current hometown, I don't move and live in these places because giants were there, by the way. You just happen to be everywhere I go. So I'm a kind of intuitive giant hunter without even realizing it. So here we have Europe again. Again, we've got Britain. We've got many accounts in Ireland. We have all the stories of the Fomorians and the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were giants. We have accounts coming all across North Africa, the Bible lands. Literally every country you can think of, you can find accounts that are there. This is just a couple of examples from Ireland. In 1950, some huge skeletons were found in the mounds surrounding a site called Four Knocks in Ireland. This is the area of the Boyne Valley where the famous Newgrange and Knowth are located. This was found in 1895. It was reported in 1895. And this was found in County Antrim, Ireland, and it was said to be 12 foot 2 inches high. and it was basically almost mummified in the peat bog. It was transported around the country and in London, and it disappeared. No one knows what happened to it. And it had 6 fingers, 6 toes on the right foot. The funniest thing is that they had to cover him up because the Victorian ladies kept fainting. Moving on. Further accounts have been found in Ireland as well. This one is just a mere 10 feet tall. You know what they say about men with big feet? This is an account from South Africa. Well, not an account. This is actually a carved foot from South Africa with my good friend Michael Tellinger standing next to it. We visited here last June 2014, and we have other accounts here of 10 feet tall skeletons being found in the area. However, this would be, if this was accurate, this would be a gentleman, 25 feet tall. But this is millions of years old, and it's in solid granite. So it's thought now it may be carved out to represent the giants that were there, or they just had very large feet. So we go down into Africa, we've got the Bible lands here, many accounts here. We're going to look at some of those shortly. But here, even in Egypt, we find stories here, which not many people really know about. If we go sort of further south to Philae Island, we find this account. This is very interesting, actually from the Temple of Isis on the banks of the Nile. And a row of tombs were opened, and a prehistoric race of giants were found buried there. And the tallest one was 11 feet and 1 inch tall. Now, that's quite an accurate measurement, in my opinion. That's not just roughly 11 feet or twice the size of a modern human. It's 11 feet, 1 inch. Many of them were 7 feet. Another one was measured 7 feet and 8 inches tall, but the largest was that. So even in Egypt, we find this. And we also have this very strange photo from a researcher called Gregor Spory, who investigated and got in touch with some old-style grave robbers 100 miles north of Cairo. And he showed them this mummified finger. You can see how big it is because you've got one of the banknotes here. And when they decoded it, they did x-rays on it. It's certainly a human-type finger. So either this guy just had massive hands or he was a 16-foot tall giant. So we find this even in Egypt. And you start looking into the legends and the stories of ancient Egypt, or ancient Kemet, and you find this. We're actually going there. Andrew Collins and I are going there next September to investigate these accounts, and we're doing a tour there with the Kemet School of Ancient Mysticism. And they're going to try and get us access to some of these giants. But the Bible lands, oh my God, there's so many accounts in the Old Testament, also in the book of Enoch, which you have the book of giants in. I'm not going to read through all these. I'll leave it up here for a moment. But it just shows you that even in prehistory, potentially over 4,000 years old, the Old Testament and the book of Enoch and so forth, we find hundreds of accounts of giants. Here's just a selection of the most interesting ones. And they talk about the matter of fact. It's not like it's some mythological, strange story. They're giving precise measurements, precise stories of what happened, and accounts of how they were dealing with these terrorizing giants. In Italy, we find examples. I'm just jumping around the world here. I just want to give you a kind of outline of this. We find them all over Europe, even in Bosnia, even all through Eastern Europe, Hungary, Switzerland, and so on and so forth. But there's a couple of accounts in Italy that kind of grabbed my attention. This one is, the one on the left here is just a simple 7 feet woman, which is quite interesting. And then again, we have other evidence here from Turin, Italy, of over 7-foot skeletons. But it's this one here from 1838 that caught my attention because this was measured to be over 10 feet tall, and it was even illustrated. And they dug down into this cavern, found this hieroglyphic writing, and discovered a 10.5-foot tall skeleton. And here we have it here. In Italian measure, it was 11 feet and 4 inches, but in English, it was just 10.5 feet. I don't know how they do that. This just shows you the illustration, which I find quite compelling, because this was actually illustrated back in 1838. Here's another example from Europe, 1890. And there's been some very, very large giants discovered in this area. Some of them, I believe, there's further accounts that follow on from this, but there's been some research on this actual bones that we're going to be looking at hopefully soon. There's some in France, there's some in Germany, but it's the ones in France that we know still exist. And my good friend Micah Ewers, who is one of our researchers based in Oregon, has been working with us to get access to these. So we're looking for a French-speaking giantologist, if anyone knows any. And we'll be investigating this because we know the bones still exist. But Geoffrey of Monmouth, even in the history of the kings of Britain back in the 1100s, may have been making a reference to Turtle Island, or what was once called Turtle Island, and actually North America. Beyond the realms of Gaul, beneath the sunset, lieth an island girt about by ocean, guarded by ocean, erst the haunt of giants. What is he talking about? Where is he talking about? He could be talking about this landmass we're currently on now. But before we go there, I want to jump down South America and have a look around the area of Patagonia and the Antarctic islands, because some very interesting accounts have emerged from the 1500s of some very early explorers who witnessed many of these giants around this area here, the tip of sort of Chile and Argentina, Tierra del Fuego and Patagonia, and also down here we have the Ona or the Onas Indians on these islands here, and they kind of hop between these islands on rafts and boats and get around. Here's the Falklands and so forth. But this is just one illustration from the 1500s that recorded these giants. And these were well-known sailors from Spain, from Britain, such as Magellan and also Antonio Pigafetta. And they actually write about this in their diaries and voyage notes. And there was even, this here was even photographed in 1898. These are two of the giants from this particular area, just down here on these particular chain of islands, where the giants were still living. And some of these were recorded up to 10 feet tall and witnessed by people for over 400-year period. And they still existed in the early 1900s. They've now pretty much died off, but it does suggest that there was something strange going on at the tip of South America. Even Sir Francis Drake spoke about and witnessed the giants back in 1578 when he did his circumnavigation of the globe. He left Britain and he heard about the stories of the giants in Patagonia. He went via North America, via Virginia, which he named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, and made his way down to Patagonia because there was like a sort of giant frenzy going on because people had heard about these giants in North America. They were being discovered. In South America. But he personally witnessed a giant and wrote in his diaries of one that was 7 foot 6 inches tall. And he's a good authority to get anything from. And Magellan was another sailor, and he wrote in his diaries and in his sort of voyage notes, it was not altogether deceiving in naming these giants, for they generally differ from the common sort of man, both in stature, bigness, and strength of body, as also in the hideousness of their voices. I wonder what they sounded like. And here is another interesting story. Sir Francis Drake continued around the base of South America, around Patagonia, and back up again, past Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and so on, all the way back to North America, and he landed just north of San Francisco. And here he met a race of giants, and they invited him into their land, and they wanted to, crown him the local chief because he was more wise and smart than, supposedly, the local natives. But he refused. They fixed their ships and they moved on. But he recorded this again in his diaries. And so we have these very strange accounts. I'm going to present more early explorers who visited America. We'll look at some more of those shortly. But this is just a selection of accounts. One, it's just about 10 of over 1,000 we have from North America. We have 1,500 in total, 500 worldwide accounts, 1,000. We've probably got 1,200 accounts now from North America. They keep building. And again, the mega map of the giants. So let's have a look at some more early explorers, because this is where it gets really interesting, because these were genuine accounts, stories of meeting live giants. We're not talking about skeletons here particularly, although skeletons were being found at the same time. This is from 1519. This is a chap called Alonso Pineda, who was a Spanish explorer. He also was involved in seeing the Patagonian giants, and he was given the job of mapping the Gulf Coast. And it was around here, and this is actually his map that he eventually did, but all around the Gulf Coast, where the Mississippi goes into the ocean, the Gulf Coast here, and also around this area here, he witnessed many tribes of giants and had to battle with them at times. But one of the most interesting stories was that he met not only a race of giants along the Mississippi River, near where it went into the Gulf area here, but also there was a race of pygmies living with the giants. This, again, is stranger almost than the giants. What we have, when we look into the mythological record and the oral history of the Native Americans, we find more accounts of little people than we do of the giants. And there are thousands of the giants. So there's this almost like two coexisting races were living in this part of the world. They also practiced head flattening, cranial deformation, some of the ones he witnessed. And this is one of the most interesting, scary things. It was recorded that they do not eat men, but roast them only on account of the cruelties first enacted against their ancestors by the Spanish. So there were a lot of stories of cannibalism going around in this part of the world, even at the time of the early 1500s. But and the locals got so annoyed by this, they started literally cooking Spanish people when they arrived, which, yum, yum. And another very strange story came forth from 1523 as the Spanish fleet discovered the Caribbean islands. There was one giant, local native, who was Christianized and taken to Spain, and he eventually learned English, and they found out some very interesting things. This is one of the weirdest ones we came across. The report ran that the natives were white and their king and queen giants, whose bones, whilst babies, had been softened with an ointment of strange herbs, then kneaded and stretched like wax by masters of the art, leaving the poor objects of their magic half dead until after repeated manipulations they finally attained their great size. So that's how they became giants. Okay, got it. There's further, this is just a general map here. I mean, we've got a whole chapter in the book about early explorers visiting America and witnessed these live giants. But here's just some of the people who witnessed them. We have De Soto, Coronado, De Vaca. We have stories here. This is a Pineda here. He did the whole Gulf Coast area. We even have stories coming from Mexico and all this here, the Caribbean islands, obviously. And the list goes on. For actually everywhere where the rivers would run into the country, the Mississippi rivers and so forth, you would find these accounts. I mean, just as we saw in the previous example from the Caribbean, there's lots of very strange fair-skinned races of giants that were reported in North America. We have the oral history, we have the records of the Native Americans, and there are accounts going back into prehistory, deep history, that talk about a white race of giants that used to live in America. It's very odd. No one knows who they were or where they came from, but this is in the Native American records. And then we have in 1521, Francisco Gordillo and Pedro de Cuellar, they captured 70 Chicura giants in the Carolinas, and they also met up with this race called the Duher, who were white, who had beards, and who towered above them. So this is a very, very odd story. And we have further accounts. In 1528, we have further stories of, I quote, all the many Indians from Florida we saw were archers, and being very tall and naked, at a distance they appeared giants. Wonderfully built, strong, they're very gaunt, and they were very accurate in firing arrows at the Spanish. And we have many other accounts. I could go into more. Even Hernando de Soto, he sailed 9 ships into Tampa Bay, Florida, and a long story came out with this giant native chief called Tuscaloosa. And it started an all-out war between the Native Americans and the Spanish, which has gone down in history now. And even some of these actually reached into Arkansas and Tennessee and Alabama, and they went on a mission throughout all the Americas, defeating and tackling these giants. Even the famous Captain John Smith had an encounter with massive Native Americans in the 1600s. And this is actually from the record of his diaries. This up here is actually one of the giants he met, the Jake Satsquanok giant, who was potentially 8 feet tall. They measured the calf of the largest man's leg, found it 3/4 of a yard, and all the rest of his limbs were in proportion, so that he seemed the stateliest and most goodly personages they had ever beheld. His arrows were 5/4 long, headed with the splinters of white crystal-like stone. So they were using crystals for other purposes. Not so nice. But that whole area has become famous because it's near an area called Spanish Hill in Pennsylvania, going into Virginia. And they found multiple giant skeletons there in the more recent years. And even some of these, an 8-foot example, was on display at the Maryland Academy of Sciences until a few years ago, when NAGPRA removed them. NAGPRA, I just explained, is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I'm not probably going to say that again because it's quite a difficult one this time in the morning. But this is where many of the bones were removed that were on display throughout North America. There were hundreds of museums, private collections, university buildings, even shop windows in some cases, where giant bones, skulls, teeth, and so on were on display. But NAGPRA removed them, and quite rightly they were reburied, and in ceremony, which should have been done. They shouldn't have been dug up in the first place, perhaps. But because of that, we know all the stories. Let's just jump up to New England. This is an area I'm very fond of. I spent a lot of time up here. It's where my good friend Jim Vieira lives, up in Asheville, Massachusetts, up this kind of area here. Just up here. And this area called Deerfield is very interesting. This whole river, the Connecticut River, has many giants found along either side of it. Many of these have double rows of teeth, which we'll get into later. This just shows you some of the accounts we cover in the book, found throughout New England, and also it goes into New York State as well. We have Martha's Vineyard. We have two accounts from down here. Even near Boston, we find stories all through Connecticut, Rhode Island, literally everywhere you can think of. But it's Martha's Vineyard here is very interesting because this is also found there. This is like a dolmen, which we keep finding. Like we saw yesterday, we saw the one from North Salem, New York. Huge dolmen, 90-ton boulder. We have slightly smaller examples on Martha's Vineyard. This is very close to where a giant was discovered back in the 1800s that had double rows of teeth. This is another, like a hanging rock. And it's actually, they've actually propped it up. It was actually balanced on these boulders here. You can't see them really now because obviously the people living here didn't trust the design of how it was originally built. As you can see why, so they propped it up. But it was sitting there for potentially hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it was very close to here in 1859. This is called Cannon Rock. It's near a place called Lowell in Massachusetts, just north of Boston. It's also the old name for it is Phaeton Rock. And it was very near here, a place called Saugus, that a giant skeleton was uncovered. And so we keep finding these connections between giants and these strange dolmens. We find the same exact stories and connections all over Europe, especially in Britain. It was also in this area where this gentleman appeared. This was introduced to me by Ross Hamilton, so I'll give him credit for this. But Pastor Conway was a powerful shaman of the Pennacook tribe, and he was the last kingly chief or sachem, who eventually became the Bashaba, which means chief of chiefs. And this was an effort to bring together a multi-tribal confederation in the 1600s to protect themselves from the aggressive Mohawk nation in New England. When he was nearing the end of his life, he was said to live to over 120 years old, which is another thing we find with these very tall people, is that they live much longer lifetimes, as you get with the patriarchs also in the Bible. He was very well known. He was very revered by the English and the colonials and also the Native Americans before and after his life. Legend states he was so powerful that he could make water burn, make trees and rocks dance, turn dried leaves back to green, and make living snakes out of dried snake skins. One of the powers he was very good at was to summon storms at will. Now, this is something that we find again in England. Many of these giants' graves, when you disturb them, huge storms, lightning, thunder appear, and it doesn't stop until you leave the graves alone. And this is something that was written in a book called Sowers of Thunder by Anthony Roberts about all the sites in Britain. He mentioned several from North America. This was back in 1979 this book came out. But one of his powers, Pasconway, one of his powers was to create these storms, and he resorted to this when white settlers tried to arrest him. He created intense rain and wind, and he fled into the forest, and they couldn't find him because it was so muddy. And so we find this is very interesting. His powers also continued after his life. During his burial ceremony, a native witness told of a bright ascension over Mount Washington in New Hampshire, which was said to be the Great Spirit's earthly abode. Now, we must remember, this gentleman was over 7 feet in height, and he was a very interesting chap by the sounds of it. I would love to have met him. But very close to the reservation is this very strange stone circle. This is called Druid Hill Stone Circle, obviously an English kind of name. And nearby there is another site called the Beehive Chamber. And these were both recorded in some records from 1659. This was roughly not long after Pascoenway's death, so we know that the giant, well, he was probably a giant ruler, and there was probably an elite group within this tribe, but they probably were involved in building these megalithic sites. We have further accounts from Connecticut. This area here, we have the Connecticut River. It goes in different parts, but this area around here is very interesting. It's where the river runs. In 1904, a skeleton was sent to the prestigious Peabody Museum in New Haven, Connecticut. And there was a certain Dr. H.B. Ferris and Dr. George McCurdy, both anthropologists of anatomy and so forth. And they found a near 7-foot skeleton, which was put together and on display at this particular college. This is another account from Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut. An entire skeleton of an Indian giant was dug up, twice as large as that of the ordinary man, and it was found buried beneath 20 feet of gravel. And there were various other people who've seen it, and they found what appears to be a whole settlement or giant village along the edge of the Connecticut River. Even petrified giants have been found in Connecticut. This is one example here, which is very, very odd. I'm just going to show you this brief clip from the show because we've been researching a place called Rockingham, Vermont, which is just over the border of Massachusetts. And this is from Search for the Lost Giants. I'm just going to show you this, and I'll explain more as we go along. But it just gives you a brief interlude from my English voice. Okay, so I'll leave it running here, but basically we go into the records. It goes on a little while, and we look and we find evidence of when this was uncovered, who uncovered it. It was even on display in a local shop window, and we found the shop, we found the family, we went to their house, which was now near Boston, and actually talked to the people in the house. We found a cavity in their house which was 10 feet long, and we dug into it to see if a giant skeleton was in there. We're that obsessed, trust me. But what is the most interesting aspect of this is these petroglyphs. I'll just show you close up. We have these very interesting petroglyphs that was briefly shown in the show. It's this one here is very odd. Look, the rest of them are kind of normal size. They look completely normal with their horns and antennas and so forth. But this one here is very strange. This one has what appears to be kind of like what we think is a representation of double rows of teeth, and it's larger than the rest. So it could be a representation of the so-called King Philip, who was buried here and died in a battle in this area. Anyway, moving along. Even in New York State, we find various accounts. I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly. There's a place in western New York, we find many aspects of the mound culture still there. This is from the research of Norman Brokenshire. 28-pound sledgehammers were discovered, as well as various large swords and giant skeletons. In Syracuse from 1849, which was first discovered in 1819, from the diary of Victor Hopkins Clark. In the town of Syracuse, it was built over a Salt Springs reservation. It was divided up in 1794, and several skeletons were found, one of extraordinary size. The skull was comparatively large, and the jaws were surrounded with a full set of double teeth all around. So we find these strange examples of double rows of teeth. They continue. In 1854, we find the same story. Another double row of teeth discovered, another giant of colossal size. And it was so ancient, it crumbled to dust. This is another one from Jefferson County, New York, furnished entire row of double teeth yet again. So the more you look into this, we found like probably 80, maybe 70 or 80 accounts of double rows of teeth. Cattaraugus County, New York, we find the same thing. A 9-foot and a 7-foot skeleton were unearthed in the 1800s, in 1876. And as a boy, he remembered, and he got clear measurements and created these wooden models in the local museum, which are still on display. We have further accounts throughout this area. Through Pennsylvania, we have McKee's Rock, which is a mound site, which I visited, but it's completely destroyed now. New Jersey, there are stories of skeletons coming out from this area, and so on and so forth. You cannot stop finding them everywhere you look. But now I just want to quickly introduce you to Ross Hamilton. He's not physically here, obviously, but we've got a little clip of him from the show. I just want to show you. This will be the last clip I show, but I just feel like he has been our mentor, he's been our guide, he's been our inspiration throughout this whole project from day one. And he's spent almost as much time as we have getting the facts correct, working on the book. And he's really the pioneer. We call him the godfather of giantology. What a legend, this guy. So he was one of the key researchers at Serpent Mound in Peebles, Ohio. I'm not going to go into detail about the mound, but it's one of the most important sites in North America. Most interestingly, they now think it's dated to 321 BC. Some new radiocarbon dating has been carried out. Originally, it was thought to be much more recent than that. It was built in the time of the Adena, who were the earlier mound builder culture, although there are mounds that were being built in this area, in Poverty Point, Watson Break, all in Louisiana, before this time, going back 3,000 or so BC. And it does appear, as Ross says, that there was certainly a royal class of giant rulers who were part of this system. This is one of the skeletons discovered at Serpent Mound itself, over 7 feet tall. This is a mysterious postcard that appeared and was available in the early 1900s, probably excavated by Professor Putnam, who was the only excavator really at Serpent Mound. But further discoveries were found at Marietta. This is a beautiful, complex mound site in Ohio. Various skeletons were found here. One that was over 7 feet tall. And here you can just see the plan of it. It was in 1901 this particular one was discovered. And again, this is just the one I showed you from yesterday. This is the one of the 8.5-foot giant found 60 feet below a mound that had a jar with a nub of corn in it. And then when they planted the corn, they had a very powerful yield and size of crop from this ancient one piece of corn that was found with this particular giant, suggesting they had advanced technology back then and they were able to manipulate the seeds and the grains. In West Virginia, you find some examples over this area here, the Kanawha Valley, Charleston, but specifically the Grave Creek Mound I'm going to just have a quick look at here. And this is an image of the mound. I think someone had taken something before they did that. But this is 70 feet tall. It's one of the largest mounds in North America, just slightly smaller than Miamisburg in Ohio. But in 1838, apparently an 8 or so foot skeleton and a 7.4 foot female were discovered. But this is contentious story because there were two different people we found. Thanks to Andrew Collins who helped me research this. One of the early reports of a witness there, A.B. Tomlinson's grandfather, said there was no giants discovered, but another witness who was there said there were giants discovered. So this is one of those contentious stories that we kind of can't conclude, unfortunately. But what was found there was this, and this is the Grave Creek tablet. This is the mound here. I'm just sort of hanging out here, and so many of the other sites found in the area, some stone towers and so forth. But this is a fantastic place to visit. And what's interesting about this is that this appears to be some kind of Phoenician writing as decoded by epigrapher Barry Fell. And it was actually held, it was in one of the graves inside the mound. Now, if you want to see a giant skeleton for yourself, you can see this one. This is in Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. 7'6" example. It came from northern Kentucky, although it does appear to have acromegaly, which is pituitary-induced gigantism. But it was found in the mound culture area, so who knows? It could be a relation of the giant mound builders. Even in Arkansas, we do find some examples. We just included a couple in the book, a Chickasaw Mound, and also up in Beaver Lake, obviously Spiro Mound as well. In 1870, the whole area... Has anyone been to Chickasaw? Am I saying that correctly? Anyone been up that way? No, okay. It's a good few hours away from here, mind you. It's on the other end of the state. But 8 and 10 feet 10 feet tall skeletons were found in the mounds, going from 1970 onwards. It basically became open season there, and the treasures were found, artifacts, so on and so forth, and they were just sold all around the world, and this, that, and the other. And basically all that's left is this, unfortunately. It's just a clump of trees on one mound. I think there might be a few others in the area. I'm actually going to go and investigate this over the next week or so. I'm going to be doing a little mound trip myself, hunting for giants. Well, not hunting as such, as the way you hunt, but there's many accounts. There's some from 1901. They found a 29-inch femur, which would be a skeleton over 8 feet tall. Femur's the thigh bone, obviously. In 1976, even in relatively recent times, I would have been 3 years old at the time, a 7-foot skeleton was unearthed in the area when they were digging a basement for the house. And this is up in the Ozark Cave in Arkansas, the Beaver Lake area. It's now been completely flooded, but this actually appeared in a Rosicrucian publication describing a skeleton almost 10 feet tall discovered. And some of the skulls of what they found are there. And you can see there some of them are cranially deformed. This is actually the lake. This is actually was scuba dived by Bill Vieira and Jim. They went down there and they kind of tried to find the location, see if any more bones were sitting around, but unfortunately they couldn't find it. But there was an interesting article that described what was going on there. And there's just the notes here. The historical feats of the Ozarks held our attention. By far the most fascinating discovery was one made by an aged recluse and naturalist who for 10 years had lived in a shelter cave near where we camped. Dad Riggins spent much of his time digging in the ashes, which form the floor of many of these caves. At a depth of more than 3 feet, he found the remains of several giant human skeletons, including an almost perfect skull, which differed in many particulars from a modern specimen. When partly joined, the largest skeleton was almost 10 feet tall, and they also found hieroglyphics in this area as well. And this was a verification of the account that we saw just previously. Spiro Mounds, this is a very interesting site. Up on this, I think I've got it in the wrong place. It should be up there a little bit further. And this is very interesting. So I'm going to meet up with the guys who wrote this brilliant book from the area. And this is like a quad mound, but in 1930s onwards, it was dug into haphazardly by the Pecola Mining Company, and it became like the King Tut of the Arkansas Valley. And this was like a headline, and they just basically demolished the whole area. But what they did find was particularly interesting. Among the treasure finds is a large femur, indicating its owner must have been about 9 feet tall. Bones and skeletons of other human beings are of normal size. So there appeared, as Ross mentioned, like a giant elite was involved with the mound builder culture. And there are stories that Greg Little informed me of recently where they actually even had their own villages separate from the main population, and they interbred between themselves. Further examples were found. He was more than 7 feet tall. The jaw would fit around my face. It was more or less in pieces. We had to put him together, you see. He was bound to be a giant. Some very beautiful artifacts were also discovered in this area as well. Further accounts came forth. An 8.5-foot skeleton was discovered with these beautiful artifacts, but most of them have now disappeared. And there are stories that say some of the best examples were taken away by the Smithsonian. That's a good little noise you made there. I'm going to mention the Smithsonian again. You have to all make that sort of noise as well. Okay, so the Smithsonian, this is the bane of the giant researcher. This is where many of the bones were taken to, they were collected by. But weirdly, 17 accounts appear in their own annual reports, their own excavations in the late 1800s of giant skeletons. They found between 7 and 8 foot tall skeletons throughout the Americas, throughout North America rather. And you ask them, oh, well, can I please have a look at the skeletons that you have in your records? No, they don't exist. And they never existed. They disappeared the whole lot. Here's just some of the accounts. We have an entire, quite lengthy chapter devoted to investigating the Smithsonian, which we've done very thoroughly. And we've worked with various researchers and people even who have worked at the Smithsonian before. And basically, they sent out teams of people in the late 1800s, hundreds of employees, to collect skulls and specimens and so forth, to be returned to the Smithsonian, to be put on display, they all disappeared. Every single one, literally every single one. The only one they have available to view, which is still in the basement, is a 6'3" example of a giant native, but that's it. This guy here was one of the main reasons it all went wrong. He was a guy called Ales Hedlichka. He was involved in the eugenics movement, a pre-Nazi and philosophically funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, of all things. He was a racist, basically, and he ran the Smithsonian with draconian zeal. And so the whole of, North American history was shaped by this very annoying gentleman. So, but so it's a big problem. So he was just one of them, really. I mean, he came in 1910. He became the head of anthropology in 1910. But before that, we had John Wesley Powell, we had Cyrus Thomas, and various other people who were running it. And the problem was, at that time, something called manifest destiny was forming. And also the whole kind of myth of evolution was forming as well. And these became very strong, and these became like the paradigm that was being created. And it was actually the Smithsonian that kind of forced the story, the myth, the legend of evolution through. And so this was the problem. So when they kept finding giant skulls that had 36-inch circumference, it didn't fit with their stories. And it also proved that the Native Americans were much smarter, more sophisticated than we are or anyone else is. And so, but all the English and the Europeans and others were coming over to America. And it really is summed up quite nicely by this brilliant author called J. Edgar Smoot, brilliant surname. And basically, this is from one of his recent books. I'll just read this to you. With land rights being one of the foremost issues facing lawmakers, having evolutionary theories that labeled the American Indian populations as savage would be seen as a pivotal breakthrough in addressing and advancing a manifest destiny agenda, along with a host of other scientific, governmental, and social ethnological issues. So basically what he's saying is, and this is where the giants just happened to be being discovered at this time, that they had to remove the giants. They couldn't really allow this elite, this advanced technological race who had they studied the ancients studied astronomy. They had advanced farming techniques. They had brilliant pottery, and they worked with gold and all the different metals. They couldn't admit that. Otherwise, if they did admit that, then the rights to the land would have to remain with the Native Americans because they were more advanced than the incoming Europeans. What was that? Where did that come from? God, I think a giant has just struck a gong. More examples from the Smithsonian. I'm not going to go into detail. They're all in the book. We highly recommend you buy our book. These are the two of the key books. This is the 5th and the 12th Smithsonian reports from my buddy Jim Vieira, my co-author. And the double rows of teeth thing. Now, this is weird. I mean, the one on the left's a real photo. The one on the right's a reconstruction. But we found, we've got an entire chapter devoted to this, the double rows of teeth. It was one of the traits of the giants, which we think was a genetic throwback from potentially other cultures around the world going back into deep prehistory. We have evidence in the Canadian Great Lakes area that double rows of teeth were known about with the giants going back 6,000 or 5,000 years. Here's just some examples here. But one of the other strangest anatomic anomalies is this. Now, this, unfortunately, is not a real one. We did some research on this, but this has been linked with a story from the Sayre area of Pennsylvania. However, we do have 5 other accounts of genuine horned skull discoveries in North America. So it's very strange. What is going on here? We also have the cranial deformation story as well. These 3 examples here are from North America. This is from Pumapunku in Bolivia. All through the Californian Channel Islands, we find examples, most specifically on Catalina Island. These are just some of the ones we did uncover. Here's some of the accounts, up to 8-foot-tall skeletons. There was one that was 9'2". Jim and Bill investigated this for the show. We have a chapter called Further Afield, where we discuss all the discoveries here. These were some recently discovered photographs and analysis put together by a gentleman called L.A. Mazzulli. Some of you may know him. And they realized that this guy must have been 8'6" tall. We find other examples around San Nicolas Island from 1897 of a huge femur bone that was discovered that indicated giants existed there. And also on this island here, and this is various islands, double rows of teeth were also discovered. And even on Santa Rosa, we have this, where over 7-foot skeletons were discovered that dated to over 7,000 years old. So this is very strange. This gets into like prehistory, archaic times here. And this has all been carbon dated. And the same story we get throughout Nevada. I'm just going to have to run through these because I'm running out of time. But 11-foot skeletons were found. A definite 6'6" skeleton was found around Humboldt Lake and Lovelock Cave. And you can just see the size of the jaw here. Here's some of the skulls that were actually on display for a very long time. They're now in the basement. They're very large, some of these. These were accounted for. And even going into Sonora, Mexico, we have an entire chapter on this, where they found not only giant skeletons, but elongated skull people in the same area. And this is the land of the giants, the lost city of giants, where we're going to investigate ourselves, possibly on this trip. But it's pretty dangerous down there, I hear, the cartel and so on and so forth. But I'm just going to finish up with looking at just some of the theories about the origins of the giants. Just a couple of minutes. I think I'm going to be within my hour. But this is where it gets very strange. I mean, when you think about giants and these skeletons and so forth, people there's a big thing going around, it's the Nephilim. Elaine Mazzulli, Fritz Zimmerman, Steve Quayle, other authors propose that they're the Nephilim from the Bible lands. They came over, they were driven out. That's a weird gong. They were driven out from the Bible lands during the Great Exodus. This is all, the biblical stuff. Forget the latest movie about the Exodus, crikey. And basically, they were driven out and they came over to America and founded the giant races of North America. I don't really buy that personally. I think it's a lot more complicated and there's a lot larger time scale we're dealing with here. These teeth you can see here are from the Denisovan Cave in northern Siberia. And they're twice the chewing surface of any other. Is this a hint? They're twice the chewing surface of the normal sized tooth. And these are over 40,000 years old. And the thing is, these were potentially giants. And they may have made their way over to North America. There's a lot of evidence to say they did, whether it's from the Bering Land Bridge or whether they sailed over about, potentially 30 or so thousand years ago. And so that could be one area to look at here. This is the size of the tooth we're dealing with. They thought it was a cave bear's tooth when they originally found it. I have to credit Andrew Collins here because he sort of pointed me in the direction of all this research and wrote a brilliant piece in Path of Souls, co-authored with Greg Little about that. You also got Homo heidelbergensis from South Africa. These were between 7 foot and possibly 12 feet tall. And these were the early ancestors of the Denisovans. These go back to 200 and beyond, 200,000 years and beyond. And this has been verified by Professor Lee Berger and Professor Francis Thackeray. This is an actual fossilized bone, thigh bone, which is twice the size of a modern human. And then we have the Cro-Magnon as well. This is very odd. This Cro-Magnon, modern type human skulls and skeletons, which often reach over 7 feet in Europe, have been found in North America, older than the emergence of Cro-Magnon man in Europe. And so now there's a story going around, thanks to various researchers, that the giants may have originated here. And this goes in with the myths and the stories of the Native Americans, including many stories that are linked with the megafauna extinction 12,000 years ago. Vine Deloria is one of the key people involved in this. And he was a mentor to Ross Hamilton. He's passed away now. He actually died roughly 10 years ago, just a few days ago, 10 years ago, on the 13th of November. And one of the strangest stories is that he recounts a legend that states that the giants used to herd mammoth like cattle. They were that big. And this must have been over 12 or 13,000 years ago. So we're looking in deep prehistory here. And there's a lot more to it than this. Obviously, I'm just giving you some examples here. And even the famous Edgar Cayce, who has been talked about a lot at this conference, who was an incredible gentleman, talked about in many of his readings giants in North America, building the mounds and being involved in a very matter-of-fact way. He said it as well, and it's very, very interesting. We have an entire chapter devoted to mystics and secret societies that include Edgar Cayce. But at the end of the day, yes, and it's becoming time for... So I want to just close up here and thank you for listening. My talk on the giants. Thanks for listening. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So cool.